Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first training session on the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. You may have heard this model referred to as MC-FRM. We'll be using that term throughout the training. I'm your host and moderator, Julia Neisel. I manage the Storm Smart Coast team for the state's Office of Coastal Zone Management. Thank you for taking 2.5 hours out of your day to join us as we talk about MC-FRM basics this afternoon. We hope you'll leave with a better understanding of modeled sea level rise and coastal storm conditions, level 1 MC-FRM products, and we hope you'll gain a foundation of information to be able to participate in our subsequent trainings on planning applications, and then also additional technical information as well. We are recording this session for anyone who would like to review content at a later time or would like to share the information with your colleagues. Now, I would like to ask the rest of the training team to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Margot Mansfield. I'm a coastal hazards and climate specialist working with Julia at CZM. And I also sit in our Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs climate team.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirk Bosma. I'm a senior coastal engineer with Woods Hole Group, and Woods Hole Group was the developer of the Massachusetts Coastal Risk Model.
Hi everyone, my name is Brittany Hofnagel. I am a climate resiliency specialist with Woods Hole Group, and I was heavily involved in a lot of the GIS post-processing of the MC-FRM.
Thank you, team. We are going to start our training with an overview of the responses you provided in the training survey. I want to recognize that we have a variety of expertise in the room. Next slide, Kirk. The primary respondents are coastal planners. We see that we have about 1/4 of our respondents focused on coastal planning. Next slide. Yeah, 19% focus their day job on permitting, and we have 14% of coastal engineers working in the field represented through the survey. Next slide. We wanted to hear what your familiarity is with a number of MC-FRM products that have rolled out over the last couple of years. And the annual flood exceedance probabilities, 46% of respondents indicated that they have already been using those in their work. And then the other point of reference is that 39% of respondents did indicate that they have yet to use the MC-FRM products. And that is why we have developed this training in order to meet a variety of needs. In terms of topics of interest, we put forward a variety for you to indicate your interest. And interestingly, over 1/3 of respondents checked off everything. And that is one of the reasons why we are offering the 3-part training series in order to cover all of this content, from fundamental sea level rise projections all the way through how the data products have been used in case studies, and how the information is unique from other flood risk products that are out and readily used by practitioners. So Brittany's going to walk us through some group norms for our training session.
Thanks, Julia. For everyone that is here, just want to bring to your attention that there's a lot of information that will be involved in this training today. So we want, if you're able to, try your best to be present today. Do your best to avoid multitasking. Means close your email, close any chats and tabs if you're able to. From here on, we ask that you put your questions in the chat. We will do our best to monitor the chat box below and answer any simple questions, but please note that we will be collecting any more in-depth questions and we'll be able to follow up after the series of trainings. We do ask that you don't use the chat for side conversations, and again, focus that chat box for questions. And keep in mind, if you did not complete the survey that CZM hosted, please do so that you're able to receive follow-up information regarding future trainings and those answers and future opportunities.
Right, thanks, Brittany. There's going to be a link to the survey shared in the chat in a second. So if you haven't filled out the survey yet, please do so, and that'll give you access to all future workshops and information that comes out of the workshops. So let me give a quick overview of what we're going to try to cover over the course of the next 3 workshops here. We've divided this into 3 workshops. The first one here is basic information, an overview of the model development, some definitions, and just the level 1 data that is publicly available out there. If for some reason, given the limitation of the number of people we have allowed in here right now, you think that this is stuff that you really understand, then perhaps you can jump off and let someone else on for that particular topic. There is a lot of information we're going to cover today, and it does provide a good wealth of information. Workshop 2, which will be May 4th, and we'll post that later, gets into a little bit more of the advanced data that's available. And both the level 1 and level 2 data are publicly available data. We'll be covering some more definitions, looking at those advanced outputs, compare, FRM to other models such as, the FEMA work, the U.S. Army Corps NACS model, just so you can get an understanding of how they differ and what the pluses and minuses are. We'll go a little bit into the Resilient MA tool, which some people know, and then really start to get into more examples of applications of the data. And then workshop 3 really gets pretty technical, focused on design parameter development from the model, how you can use it, using information for boundary conditions for other models, and again, further example applications of MC-FRM and the data. So today, workshop 1, major topics. We'll go a little bit into the history of the model. Some of you probably are familiar with this, have seen it before. We'll spend quite a bit of time on definitions. There's certainly, depending on your experience and your background, there's certainly been some misunderstanding on what some of the terminology is from the model. Just terminology in coastal storms in general. We'll go over the overview of the and development of the model of MC-FRM, going a little bit back to the predecessor, the Boston Harbor flood risk model as well. Look at the sea level rise projections that feed the model. Go over some of the advantages and limitations that still exist. No model is perfect. MC-FRM is not perfect either. And then we'll go into talking about the data outputs, do a little bit of viewing, download, where you can view MC-FRM results, where you can get the information and the data to utilize. So where did this all start? Really, Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy was a big driver for a lot of what happened in the Atlantic seaboard, and especially in the East Coast, upper Northeast. Pretty remarkable storm. Pretty fortunate, frankly, in Massachusetts that it took a left-hand turn towards New Jersey and New York when it did. We were spared really the major brunt of that event. However, Mass DOT and others, Federal Highway, realized, what happened in New York could potentially happen here in Massachusetts. And one of the big things that was thought about was the central artery tunnel system. So the picture in the upper left is a picture from New York post Sandy. And the central artery tunnel system, although an amazing engineering feat, really has a fair amount of vulnerabilities to coastal based flooding. It's not a very redundant system, meaning of the thousands of assets that are spread out over the landscape. If one vent building or one egress goes out, the tunnel has to get shut down. So it's not just water flowing down into the tunnel that would be a potential problem. It's really impact to any number of thousands of assets that make it vulnerable. So it's an amazing system, but not overly redundant. And so Mass DOT and others and Federal Highway started saying, well, what's the real risk here? What's the probability of flooding? Not just is it going to flood or is it not going to flood? Like, what do we really need to plan for? And then because it's made up of so many assets and so many components, they really need to understand what was vulnerable and what the priority was for this multi-billion-dollar system. They certainly couldn't redo the whole thing. They certainly couldn't try to fix it all. And so cost-effective prioritization of how to manage the system was really, really important. And so then the final thing was, what do we do about it? If we can figure out what the probability is and what the priorities are, then how do we really plan for this really, daunting situation that we're potentially facing? And those questions really resound with a lot of communities and a lot of stakeholders when we start thinking about climate change. I think there's been a long-standing process of kind of overwhelming despair in some regards. And when you think about climate change, because you just can't, and sea level rise and coastal storms, because you just can't really address it when you look at the way some of the the previous information has been presented with, just very big storms covering large areas. And it really creates a situation where you don't know where to start. So that was part of the problem we were trying to solve here. There was, of course, existing information out there already. FEMA had their maps out there, which were certainly the best information that was available for a very, very long time, and really fed into building codes and everything else. And it is still a solid piece of information to look at and apply. It just really is for a different purpose, right? It's not for planning, not for infrastructure. It's really for thinking about insurance, right? And so it looks backwards in time. It doesn't look forward. It looks at only historical storm. It's one condition that they look at, which is this historical 100-year storm event. Region 1 is a little bit different, as we'll get into, in workshop 2 and a little bit today, than the rest of the regions, because it does not use dynamic modeling. The transite-based analysis only focused on present-day conditions. What we were looking to do here was look forward in time. And so you can see some of the limitations in just how FEMA does their stuff. You have a 2-foot elevational jump along this line, probably not that realistic. Okay, maybe, but I've never seen water jump up 2 feet on a line like that. Then there's the National Storm Surge Hazard Maps. Those are completed with this model called SLOSH. They're the worst possible scenario for emergency planning. They look at tropical cyclones only. They don't include the impacts of waves or nor'easters, really for a different purpose again, which is evacuation and human life. So for example, if you're at the airport, you really don't know how to plan for something like this if you're at Logan, because it's just all underwater. You don't know what the risk level is. Maybe this storm has a 0.001% chance of occurring. And do you really need to design a building to that particular level? Uncertain. Again, just present day conditions only. There's, of course, a lot of these climate change viewers out there. This one is from NOAA, sea level rise viewers. These are first order assessments of where sea level may be. It's called the bathtub approach, which means you just fill up the water level, and if the water gets above your land elevation, then it must get wet. Certainly great for a first order assessment, certainly reasonable when you think about just mean water levels on a sunny day condition. But if you're trying to incorporate storm conditions in that, there's no case where the water is a flat water system. If I fill my bathtub at home, that's fine. There's no storm. I put my 4-year-old son in there, Hurricane Jackson, now water's going all over the place. And that's what you see when you go out to the coast. And so it has some limitations in terms of where things may or may not flood. And to give you an example of that, here's a bathtub type approach to kind of the Boston Harbor area. Yellow is just 12 feet NAVD 88. Anything under that will get wet. That's what's shown here. But we know in reality, a storm coming through that peaks at 12 feet is much, much different. So here's MC-FRM, or in this case, BHFRM results for a storm that runs through that peaks at 12 feet. You get much, much different variability over the landscape because the water surface elevation changes due to winds, waves, approach directions, things like dams, pumps, that all play a role in how water physically moves and interacts with the landscape. And so there's a pretty big difference between that bathtub approach and a dynamic physics-based approach when you start thinking about where flooding may or may not occur. So that led us to this high-resolution probabilistic modeling that we started to develop. The initial project was the Boston Harbor flood risk model, which is focused on Boston Harbor. That got expanded to the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. The real value of this here is we're getting a lot more information than just are you wet or not. We are getting the actual duration of flooding, the probability, the depths. We have waves and winds incorporated in there. So you can look at a lot more information, get a lot more data that might be useful out of the model. So that initial pilot project was released in about 2015, 2016 timeframe. It won the 2017 Environmental Excellence Award, and that spurred on the generation of the flood risk model for the entire coastline of Massachusetts. So we went from the Boston Harbor flood risk model to the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. That change from going from BHFRM to MC-FRM had some technical upgrades to it. We updated the sea level rise projections. We expanded the storm data sets, both for the tropical and extratropical cyclone conditions, which means hurricanes and nor'easters. We included dynamic wave overtopping at structures, which we'll get into a little bit more in workshop 2. Updated the landscape and topography of various parts of Boston and Cambridge. And then we also created this level 2 output of data, which was not available as part of BHFRM. So just some definitions, just so we're all on the same page here. We're going to go through some general coastal processes definitions, some MC-FRM specific definitions, and then FEMA definitions, because we're going to do some model comparisons in workshop 2. We might hold off to then, but we'll touch a little bit on that here. So we talked a little bit about the overview, the history of the model, go into some of these definitions. Storm surge, what is that? Really simply, it's just an abnormal increase in the sea level caused by a storm event. So you have winds, you have pressures that change the water level way offshore. It doesn't really become a visible thing until you get closer to shore, when it starts piling up against the increasing or decreasing depth levels along the coastline. And you can see there's a wind-driven part, which is very large, and there's also a pressure-driven part, which usually makes up a smaller part of that. So again, in deep water, it's not really noticeable, but when you get closer to the shore, that water gets pushed downward by the pressure in the winds. It cannot move any lower, so it has to go up, and it has to go up in a direction inland. And then obviously, as shown in that graphic there, rising sea levels only compound that problem, right? So you have dynamics of storm surge on top of just your general mean sea levels increasing. So just a little bit further, that storm surge and storm tide, we think gets confused quite a bit. Sometimes you'll hear the reporters on the news go, oh, it was a 15-foot storm surge, or the storm surge got up to 12 feet, NAVD 88, or 12 feet elevation. that's not really the correct terminology. And so just want to get through this here. So first of all, if you look at we're just comparing two storms that happened recently in Boston in 2018. So the tides go up and down, and the duck is going up and down, corresponding to the green and blue here, is it's going up and down between high tide and low tide, which is very important because if a storm comes through at a certain tidal level, that's going to result in completely different results. Now, in the Boston area, generally we have a tide range of around 10 feet. So that's a big player in what's going to happen because we've never seen a storm surge in this area of 10 feet or more. And so what does that mean? If you look at the blue and the green is the actual observed water surface elevation. The blue was the predicted tide based on the tidal constituents, the movement of the sun and the moon relative to the earth. And so you get this perturbation in what was expected based on what's actually occurring with winds and storms and pressure differences. And that difference is shown as that purple line. Right? Sometimes that's called the residual of the water surface elevation. And so the residual in both Grayson and Riley here is shown there. The storm surges that increase in that residual that then gets added on top of your normal tide is shown in this lower picture here. The storm tide then is the elevation that is reached when you add storm surge to your tide. So Grayson had an actual lower storm surge, 3.3 feet at its maximum, but a larger storm tide. Why? It happened to align or occur with a larger portion of the tidal cycle. It happened to be a spring, very high spring tidal situation. It aligned very closely to a high spring tide. And so you ended up with a higher storm tide of 9.7 feet. Riley had a much higher actually surge, one of the largest surges we've ever seen. But the storm tide, the actual peak that it reached, was actually lower than Grayson, 9.2 feet. Now, if you remember, Riley had pretty devastating effects in other areas because it was so strong in terms of winds and waves. There was a lot of erosional effects with it, but the actual water level was actually lower. So difference between storm surge and storm tide, just important to remember that when you're talking about how you start to add things up for a total water level. The other thing that always gets a little bit confusing is waves, right? So you have waves that are riding on top of this water level. You have a wave height, which shown here in the upper one is the vertical distance between the crest and the trough of the wave. Now that goes above and below what we're calling that still water level, or that water level that is pushed up due to storm surge and the tides, right? The storm tide, if you will. Then there's the wave crest elevation. So a lot of people will take the still water elevation and say, if the still water elevation was 10 and my wave height was 2, well, that means I must get up to 12. Well, that's not really how it works because the wave goes in above and below that. So you have to think about what the wave crest elevation is, not just the wave height. So when we talk about a total water surface elevation due to waves, we're actually adding a wave crest as opposed to the full wave height. Wave statistics we'll get into next time, workshop 2. There's a maximum, a significant, all which come into play when we start talking about these total water levels. The waves also induce some other things. They induce what's called wave setup. That's caused by the dissipation of wave energy, and that slopes up above the still water elevation. So the wave setup is shown here, is that nonlinear increase or push of water due to the waves against the shoreline. That's in addition to the storm surge. You also have run up, which happens when the waves hit the shoreline and then run up. And then you have wave overtopping, which is much more dramatic and probably much more familiar, which is a water volume that's actually passed over the land, typically at a structure that's trying to stop the wave energy. It can also happen at natural features, dunes and things of that nature in places, but much more dramatic at coastal structures. So those are some of the definitions of waves. Just to unpack the water surface elevations just a little bit more, there's the still water level, which is the tide, right? Plus that surge, plus if you have sea level rise is included. Now, FEMA doesn't include the sea level rise, but they basically say, well, it's tide plus surge. That's what their still water level is. That's that red line. What we do when we have MC-FRM is we have the tide surge plus sea level rise in out years plus wave setup because it's automatically numerically included in the model. interestingly enough, all the other FEMA regions besides one include that definition of still water level because they numerically model the storms as well. Region 1 is just a little bit different. So we'll get more into this workshop too, but I did want to touch on this FEMA base flood elevation. Base flood elevation sometimes gets confused with the still water elevation. They are two different things. They're not the same. The still water elevation is not the same as a base flood elevation. Base flood elevation includes the effects of waves. And in that regard, it's comparable to the MC-FRM maximum wave crest elevation that we produce. Again, a workshop 2 thing, just to know that it includes the effects of waves in that mix, not necessarily just wave setup, but the wave crest going up and down, wave run up, overtopping, those types of things. So a lot of times BFEs are getting compared to still water, and there's a lot of confusion on what's what. Just understand that the BFE includes the effects of waves. Some MC-FRM specific definitions. So we use annual exceedance probability or coastal flood exceedance probability a lot. What that is, it's the probability that at least one event in excess of a particular magnitude will occur in any given year. So it's a probabilistic value, right? So the 1% AEP, which is that light green there, is a 1 in 100 or 100-year return period flood or water surface elevation. The 1 in 20 or the 5% AEP is a 1 in 20 or a 20-year type flood, a 20-year return period event, right? And so when you're looking at the whole, what we produce from MC-FRM is that full distribution of annual exceedance probabilities. It's not just looking at what FEMA does, which is just one storm. And that's really, really important because even one storm that might produce a 100-year level in one location probably doesn't produce a 100-year level in another location. Right? Storm tracks, winds, all these things change from storm to storm. So you can't possibly just simulate one storm and expect to get the 100-year condition everywhere, which is an important thing to know. So again, water surface elevation in MC-FRM's terms is a still water elevation. It includes the tide, storm surge, sea level rise, and wave setup, all to get that base elevation or that still water elevation. And then when we talk about maximum wave crest elevation or wave action water elevation, that's that water surface elevation value plus the maximum wave crest, which in this case, we're using 0.75 of the wave height. And that produces what is called the design flood elevation for federal highways, which is why we had to produce that at the beginning. But that maximum wave crest elevation is then the peak water level that is reached when you include the waves riding on top of that storm surge, sea level rise, tides, wave setup. So we're now at a quick knowledge check. I know that was a lot of information, but let's go through some real simple questions and see how that goes. There should be popping up 3 questions on your screen for a knowledge check 1. And Julia, I'll let you moderate this part.
Thank you, Kirk. So please go ahead and click your responses on the pop-up window that should have appeared in your Zoom. Thank you for your responses. We're at 50%, so keep your responses coming. We're going to check in on the answers shortly. Looks like responses are leveling off. And we'll give it 30 more seconds. No Googling. You have to base this off of Kirk's slides.
Yeah,
Okay.
but can you tell who answered what?
You are anonymous. We will not be assigning report cards. Okay, I've ended the poll and I'm going to go ahead and share results. We'll be showing, so you should see your individual results. Now we're going to show the collective results in 1 second. Okay. So for question number 1, we have 58% of respondents answering incorrectly. The correct answer was false. So we may need to review that definition. For the question number 2, 45% of respondents correctly answered storm tide. So the key part of that sentence there was the NAVD 88. So as Kirk mentioned, whenever there is an elevation referenced, we have the storm tide. So that's the tide plus the surge from the storm. And finally, question number 3, we have 85% of respondents answering correctly. So good work on that one, 100% response rate on that one as well. So a lot of familiarity with FEMA's base flood elevation, which is no surprise given how long we all have been using the flood insurance rate maps for management purposes. I'm going to stop sharing. I hope you enjoyed that knowledge check. I'm going to hand it over to Kirk.
All right, got my screen sharing back there. Yeah, just a quick review on those knowledge checks. So to go over them again. So the maximum wave crest elevation. I'm going to just go back a couple slides just to cover that again. So this little diagram is good for that, right? So the maximum wave crest elevation. Now, if you think about it, this would be, if you look at the diagram, right? The maximum the water level gets is this maximum crest right here, right? You can see my mouse. If you add the wave height to the still water level is the dashed line, that would put it, say this is, the wave height is 5 feet and the still water level is 10. You would have a maximum wave crest elevation of 50, right? In reality, the crest is much lower than that. If you want to say it's half and half, fine, let's use that as an example. The crest would actually be 12.5. So you don't add the wave height directly to the still water level, you add the wave crest elevation to the still water level, not the wave height. That's the first one. Here's the whole storm surge versus storm tide, right? So this diagram down in the corner here, storm surge is just this distance between your normal water level and your storm tide, right? So storm surge gets, 3 feet, 4 feet. That's that increase in that normal water level. The storm tide is just the sum of all the different components that gets you up to a peak elevation, right? In that case, it's measured in some kind of datum, and this point it would be 9.7 or 9.2 feet. So that's the difference between a storm surge, which is just the difference in storm tide, which is the total. Hopefully that clarifies some of that a little bit more. All right, let's go over a little bit of an overview of the model itself. We're going to talk about development, how the model was calibrated, some of the storm climatology that goes into this as we go through this. The first thing we did once we decided we were going to go down a road of actually trying to really simulate the physics of how water was going to move in and around Massachusetts was select a specific model. We evaluated over 10 hydrodynamic models, anything from ROMS to AdCirc to FECom to Slosh, a whole bunch of hydrodynamic drivers we were looking at. We really focus on some key selection criteria in that process. We wanted to be able to handle pretty complex geometry, topography to get that flow right. We wanted to be able to simulate flow control structures at some level. We wanted variable friction ability as the landscape changed. We wanted to make sure we could simulate all the key physical processes when we're thinking about that water level. Again, we wanted to get away from a bathtub-based approach, right? So we wanted to have dynamic tides, winds, waves, all interacting with the storm. And then, of course, we had to simulate large areas. If you're talking about simulating the entire coastline of Massachusetts, that's a pretty heavy lift, pretty heavy endeavor. And so we had to really focus on those. We shortlisted 3 models. One was Slosh, one was FECom, one was AdCirc. Slosh is what, again, the hurricane evacuation centers use. And part of the reason they use it is because it can computationally run pretty quick, but it is also fairly low resolution. It's a regional model, maybe more North Atlantic versus Massachusetts. And a good indication of that is this example grid I showed up here. So if you look at those big squares, that would be the Slosh grid. And then if you look at, a more representative condition of AdCirc, all these little dots are where you get information, water level, wave height, wind speed on an AdCirc based grid. So you can really change your resolution. We couldn't really resolve the shorelines appropriately in Slosh. It didn't model waves. It was a big problem for us. We couldn't handle freshwater discharge in the model. And, it does have some limitations on how it really works. It kind of over predicts things quite a bit. And there's some papers on it out there that kind of show that. Again, it's a different model for a different purpose. We also were very strongly considering FECom. At that point in time, it was only available for academic research and education, so we didn't go that way. And frankly, AdCirc and UNSWAN is which we chose was being used at a pretty regular basis across the U.S. Any FEMA model that was being conducted for a present day scenario was using this combination of models. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers use this combination of models. And so we went down that road really because it answered all those key criteria, including the ability for us to modify the model pretty significantly to do things like pumps and dams and culverts and things that we eventually wanted to do. So it really is 2 models put together. They're tightly coupled. What that means is AdCirc talks to UNSWAN, UNSWAN talks to AdCirc at very, very high resolutional temporal time steps, sub-second. So there's a water surface elevation and a wind and a tide and a storm surge, and that interacts with the waves, and then the waves talk to the other one, and they talk back and forth every time step to say what's going on with you with what waves and what's going on with you with water levels, and they adjust based on that. Then we had to look at, well, what are we really doing here? And so to really capture the types of storms we're talking about, tropical cyclones, large nor'easters, combination type events, we really needed to simulate most of the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. And so we started with a regional mesh that's utilized by FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers. It's validated with 65 tidal stations. And then there's a sub NOAA-based mesh for the North Atlantic, gives you a little bit higher resolution. That's validated by NOAA. Those are really adequate to simulate the dynamics up to about the ocean shelf. So we know that they're adequately representing the water levels and waves and those types of things that are happening offshore. However, when we get into the Massachusetts waters and we want to get overland physical base flow, we really needed to dig down a little bit deeper. And so that's when we developed our own Massachusetts specific mesh. It was a painstaking effort. It's down to resolutions of 10 feet. It's very high resolution. So that figure in the upper right there shows what it looks like in kind of the financial district of the Boston area. We are able to telescope that mesh down. So when you're in the Gulf of Mexico, it's one resolution, but if you get down to Galveston, where we did another project, you can see it's very high resolution, which is this picture on the bottom right. We really push the limit. So FEMA models usually are say 30 feet at best resolution. We're down to 10 feet and sometimes lower in certain areas, really to get kind of site specific information. And so what does that mean? Well, you go from tens of thousands of nodal locations at the regional level to hundreds of thousands at the Northeast Atlantic mesh to millions when we talk about our specific mesh. And so we're in a much smaller area, but a much, much higher resolution. And every one of those little puzzle pieces that you see there, where they come together, that's where we're getting information on the water levels, on velocities, on wave height information, so that we can characterize what's happening physically as a storm and or tides move through the area. A lot of input went into this approach. There's a list of some of the information that we had to utilize to develop the model, including one of the primary things, and the biggest thing is the elevational information, both in the bathymetry and the topography, meaning in the water and on the land. There's also information on land cover and rivers and the actual storm climatology and flood control structures. All that got put into this model. You know, it took about 6 years to develop this at the first go round. And some of the primary data sets were topobathy developed by USGS there, but it lists all the bathymetric sources that went into it, the topographic data sources that went into it. You know, we started this in about 2014, 2015 timeframe. And so anything kind of that was after that isn't explicitly included in the model per se in the elevational landscape. The model also includes freshwater input where we had it available. We really included discharge at the major estuarine rivers, things like Charles, Neponset, Mystic. We had increasing climate change discharge included at a few of the rivers. So most of the rivers, we just have the present day discharge included. If they're small rivers, we don't even worry about it. For the larger ones in urban, very urban centers, we have climate changing discharge from other studies that were completed. Those are incorporated in the model. It's important to understand though that this is not a direct precipitation model, right? This is a coastal based model. While we do include some discharge down the rivers, which results in overbank flooding of the rivers, it is not looking at, hey, it rained when this storm came through, so my backyard flooded because I don't have good drainage. Or the stormwater system was backed up because the catch basin had a bunch of leaves in it and it flooded here, and the model isn't showing that. We are focused on basically salt water. Where does salt water go? And then a little bit in some areas, how does salt water create tailwater backup conditions with fresh water coming down the rivers? So what we found in most cases, even when we simulate, 24-hour, 100-year type discharge conditions come down the rivers, if the ocean gets there, it wins. So when you mix freshwater discharge with the ocean and storm surge and coastal-based flooding always wins. And here's just a sensitivity assessment we did in the Charles River here in a 2070 time frame with very, very large discharge coming down the river. You can see those little light green areas are the areas that increased with flooding due to the discharge coming down the river. The darker blue is all the areas that would have flooded with the ocean-based flooding anyway. So there are some, right? And you can see in this one there, the depth changes happen a little bit. And so there are some areas that the discharge mixing with the coastal piece matters, and they're very small in the bigger scale of things. And we do actually include them for the major rivers anyways, but it's not a precipitation-based model. We also include dam operations for the major coastal dams. So what does that mean? We do have dams in the model that go up the Neponset, that go up, say, like to the Baker Dam. But that dam isn't going to be overtopped by coastal flooding. It's too high, too far upstream. It's high enough where the coastal waters will go up to it, but they don't go over it. So we have those in our model, but we don't have the actual operations of that system in the model. And we don't care because the coastal-based water, again, the salt water, can't get around or over it. What we do have is things like the Charles River Dam or the Amelia Earhart Dam on the Mystic and Charles River, because they get influenced by these coastal-based storm events. In fact, they were put there primarily due to flooding that had occurred in the past due to large storms. And so we know that eventually under sea level rise conditions, they might be flanked or overtopped. And sure enough, they do. And so those are included, but we didn't just include them as dams. We actually include their operations, so how they pump and how they sluice. So we have the pump operations built in there. We have the sluicing operations built in there. Again, we're focused on a peak water elevation, a flooding elevation, but you can see the figure here. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but essentially the blue line is Boston Harbor. This is a storm event in 2070 that gets up to about 13 feet. This is the dam elevation is around, in this case, the Amelia Earhart Dam is around about 11.2. And so this pink zone is when you have flanking and overtopping starting to occur. And obviously it goes over that and floods the area behind the dams. And then if you have sluices and the ability to use a sluice, the green line shows what happens with water surface elevation upstream of the dam if you actively manage the sluice, meaning open and shut it. And the orange was just the pumps. And so sluicing definitely matters to get drainage time down better. But again, it doesn't change what your peak flood level is, right? Which is this green that occurs here during the height of the storm, because you don't open the sluices when the storm surge is coming in. You're not flooding the area on purpose, right? You close the sluices, the pumps are running, but the storm surge goes over the dam or around the dam. So we were able, those processes are built into the model. The model was calibrated and validated to a number of different situations. So we first simulated, I mentioned already that the regional grids were previously calibrated by others, but we integrated our Massachusetts specific grid into that mix and then recalibrated to just normal tides across the entire Atlantic Ocean. Here's some results of that shown here just from some of the local state time series stations. So pretty reasonable bias and RMS errors. Relative areas are very small. That's not surprising. Woods Hole, of course, gets the biggest area because it's really hard to get tides right in Woods Hole. But generally, the relative areas for normal tidal conditions are very, very small, which is not surprising since we had previously the larger models already set up that way. So that was the first thing. We also then calibrated to storm events, historic storm events in the past. Blizzard of 78 has pretty decent data, high watermark data available. And so we're able to utilize that to calibrate the Blizzard of 78. So we reran the Blizzard of 78 and calibrated to that. That's shown on the right-hand side there. I'm sorry, the left-hand side of Blizzard of 78. And so the pink areas, pink dots are where they observe these high watermark locations. What we were trying to do, we didn't have a time series of information available from actual observations, but we certainly had where that red dash line where they said this is the high watermark. And so we were able to compare our model results, which is the blue, dynamically going up and down, to get that high watermark. And we were really trying to just target to get that high watermark correct. I picked that one, which is of course very, very good. It's perfect. But they were all really pretty close, within a few inches, I would say. And so we felt really comfortable the way that the model was kind of working for those storm situations. The one on the right is the perfect storm. So that one you can see we actually had some actual time series data of water surface elevation. This one happens to be down in Rhode Island. Again, that's the red dashed line. The blue is our model. We don't get every single tide perfectly right, but again, we're trying to get that storm condition right and get that peak water surface elevation as accurate as we can. And that's what's shown there. And so we did this for a couple of extratropical storms, Blizzard 78 being one, and then also for a couple of tropical cyclones, Hurricane Bob being one of those, to calibrate the model for storm events. We also did that for waves, looking at local waves in the Boston area, in the Massachusetts area, to make sure that the waves were adequately simulated during those storm conditions. What did we then use for our climatology? So as you'll learn, one of the things that really sets the flood risk model, the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, apart is a probabilistic model. So as we talked about FEMA really looks at one storm, just one 100-year type representative condition. We're simulating thousands of storm events, both tropical and extratropical. So in that set, we use all the historical tropical cyclones that influenced Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. We re-evaluate and simulate all those storm events. We also simulate a large synthetic set of storm events working with Carrie Emanuel at MIT. We have both, and I'll get into this in a second, a present day tropical cyclone set and a 21st century tropical cyclone set, which is based on 4 different global climate models. We have over 400,000 tropical cyclones that we can look at and evaluate in that mix. Those are input into a coupled model using Holland, the Holland wind model. That's put into AdCirc to, and I'll show you in a little bit what that means, to produce a cyclonic tropical cyclone. I mentioned we have this 20th and 21st century. So built into MC-FRM, right or wrong, is an increasing intensity and frequency of these tropical cyclones. So the tropical cyclones do get stronger and more frequent as you go forward in time based on those 4 global climate models. And again, that's work by Carrie Emanuel at MIT. So we're looking at that distribution, selecting storms along that distribution to represent the hurricanes that we have in the model. And we're simulating, again, thousands of these conditions to get a full distribution of results that may occur, high tide, low tide, all these types of things. For extratropical cyclones, so this is the nor'easter types of events, we looked at just the historical conditions. Those do not change in time with changing climate conditions. We did not find enough literature to say that there was a consensus to say that there's going to be an increase and or decrease of extratropical cyclones going forward with changing climate conditions. So we identified 333 storm events, 214. That actually has gone up a little bit more recently because we included some of the 2018 stuff in this. And so we simulate all those conditions as well. So we have an extratropical cyclone set and a tropical cyclone set that we simulate for both present day and then under changing climate conditions. We also look at tidal effects in the model. So it's very important, especially when you have a 10-foot plus tide range, when a storm comes through the area. More so for tropical cyclones, which are faster, quicker moving events. So what we ended up finding is that for extratropical cyclones, when we looked at a number of those, they're slow moving. They always tend to occur over 1 or 2 tidal cycles. And so all those little colors you see there are just phase shifts in when the peak of the storm occurred with a tide. And you can see it really doesn't change that peak level much at all. And so we didn't worry about when the phase of the tide was relative to our extratropical cyclone. So in the model itself, the tides are dynamically going up and down, the storms roll through, and whatever occurs for those particular storm events. For tropical cyclones, we had to do something with the phasing because you can see from all the colors there, the phase of when a tropical cyclone, which is much faster, comes through matters with what your peak water level does. So we basically simulate those storms multiple times with phase shifting to get that distribution correct. I will say For north of the spine of Cape Cod, tropical cyclones don't amount to much, even under changing climate conditions. It's far dominated by extratropical cyclones. Cape Cod and just the probability of getting a tropical cyclone correctly into that Boston area is very, very difficult and very low probability. It does increase with intensity and increasing intensity and frequency, but it is not a major driver for the north part of the state. Now in the south, just the opposite is true. The tropical cyclones clearly dominate. So sea level rise. This was a big question that I think came up in the surveys was what is happening with sea level rise? And I thought about getting into the regional concentration pathways and all that information, but I think really what it boils down to is what we're using for sea level rise conditions in MC-FRM. And so here's the projections produced for the state by DeConto and Kopp 2017, looking at the north, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So you have 4 curves shown here as they're going out to 2100. Those range from red, which is extreme, down to this intermediate curve, which is the light green. That the first thing we did is said, okay, we should probably try to get our base water surface elevation as close as we can to the actual conditions that have occurred. And all the projections are based on a 2000 start date. The red X there is where NOAA, their most recent tidal epoch, if you go to their data, is what it's centered on, is that 1992 level. And what we did is we said, well, let's go to the most recent data that we have available and recalculate the mean sea level on the most recent 19-year tidal epoch that exists. That puts us at a 2008 baseline. So our model for present day represents 2008. Right? It's a 2008 centered from 1999 to 2017, because when we were doing this, that was the most recent 19-year epoch. 2017 was the last full data set we had. That puts us at a 2008. Why did we do that? Because we wanted to include the actual sea level rise that occurred and we observed between 1992 or 2000 and 2008, just to get us a little bit more of a realistic picture of what's actually happening. So where do we go from there? So that's the present day situation. So when we talk about present day, I just want to be clear that it's 2008. It's not 2023. It's not 2000. It's a 2008 centered water surface elevation. In MC-FRM, we use these sea level rise values for 2030, 2050, 2070. Throwing 2100 on there because that might come out later, but right now 2030, 2050, 2070. This follows the RCP 8.5 level, which is a high scenario and is on this high curve. So in 2030, that's up to, or as soon as 2030, up to 1.3 feet, or as soon as 2030, but it could be less than that, right? 2050, it's up to 2.5 feet. 2070 is up to 4.3 feet. That's what's built into MC-FRM. You can crosswalk that though to different levels, right? So in 2030, under the intermediate, that would be a 0.8. It would be 2.4 by 2070. So if you look at 2.5 by under the high, under 2050, that's like 2070 under the intermediate, right? So you can start to imagine how you can crosswalk these things, which we'll do an exercise in a second. The reason that high level was chosen was to really understand the planning level, to get the planning right? We wanted to bracket that risk, meaning if we didn't model that upper level, right, and it was higher than that, we wouldn't have had any information. We can always back it down and go lower by shifting the time scale, but we can't go higher, right? And that accounts for, given that high scenario, approximately 99.5% of the probabilities that could occur for sea level rise. So this little chart up here, this 99.5 RCP 8.5 is basically the level or the probability we're considering. it also speaks to it's greater than 99.5 of the RCP 4.5 scenario. Now, there's also this ice instability which exists out there, right? And so it's 83% if you include this ice instability. If you look at the intermediate scenario, right, and if you said you went with the 4.5, right, you're at the 95%, you say, hey, that's pretty good. But when you get to this ice instability, you're basically at 50%, which is a coin flip, meaning it could 50% chance it could be higher than that, 50% chance it could be lower than that. And so it's really, I think, important from a planning perspective that we're creating that upper bound of the assessment for this sea level rise. It's not to say that this is what's going to happen, right? It's up to these levels. But if you're planning for something, you don't want to get caught with your pants down and be low, right? If you went forward and designed something and you were too low, that'd be the worst situation you could have. So Julie, I don't know if you want to add anything from the state's perspective on this, just as well.
I'll reinforce a few points that Kirk made. Number one, the modeling requires a significant amount of effort, and the decision about the sea level rise projections was made in 2018. So at the time, we decided that we wanted to make sure that we captured what's reasonable for flood risk for critical facilities and the protection of people's lives during future storm events. And as Kirk said, it's very easy to look at the sea level rise projections, the values, and to change your planning scenario with what we provided. So if you want to look at a different representative concentration pathway, if you think that 2040, the year 2040, is when global emissions is going to peak and start to taper off, then by all means, you can look at the values that we provide for sea level rise and do what Kirk said, crosswalk back to a different scenario year that meets your needs for planning. And we are, as Kirk said, going to go through an exercise to coach you through selecting those sea level rise values that work best for your planning needs and your risk tolerance and other considerations that would come into play when you're working on projects.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So just to hammer that point home a little bit more. So, if you're sitting in there looking at a 2070 map, which has this 4.3 feet of sea level rise, and you're like, wow, that seems aggressive, and boy, we're learning more and more as we go. So let's say we're 5 years from now, we say, wow, it's really not trending that way, right? The observations seem to be closer to this light green level or this middle green level. And so I'm going to pivot a little bit there. I'm going to look at this and say, okay, I think that 2070 may be more like a 2100 condition because it seems to be trending that way. One of the things that I really like about the results that we'll get into in a second is it really gives you not just a geospatial prioritization, but also a temporal prioritization. So, a lot of times when you look at maps that just show kind of the worst case scenario, here's what flooding is going to be in 2100, or the media presents, the latest picture of what Boston looks like. It doesn't really tell you where to start, one, and really presents it as like, well, you have to do something now. I think one of the big points is like, you don't have to do everything now, right? There's a really good message here. It's like, I can wait and see on a lot of these things because my risk level is actually relatively low in the near to midterm, right? And so you can balance that risk with actually doing something at a certain site when you look at what might happen between now and 2040 or now and 2050. Again, these are projections. Nobody's saying this is what's going to happen. I'm certainly not saying that. Julia's not saying that, right? But we want to make sure that we're capturing all the potential risk that could exist, and you can always back down from that. If the opposite was true, we'd be in trouble, right? So,
Kirk, before you move on, we do have a question in the chat that's relevant to this graphic that I think we should address now. Christian in Hull has noted that our historic trend does not align with the scenarios, the future scenarios that are presented on the graphic. Could you address the low scenario in order to answer Christian's question as to why there's a jump between the historic trend and the intermediate to higher level sea level rise projections?
yeah, so you're talking about the jump from here to here?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at that. I have a feeling that this was misplotted on this. I don't know, one of my
So
colleagues
Christian,
might be on to address that.
It's not an error. So Christian, if we were to have plotted the low scenario on here, it would more closely align with our historic trend.
Oh, is he asking about a low scenario? I'm sorry.
He was asking why there was a jump from the historic trend to the future projections. And that's just because we don't have the low scenario plotted on this
Right.
graph.
Yeah, we're not presenting the low scenario here, correct? These are all increased. So the low scenario would go right from that line.
Correct.
One last thing I did want to point out, there's also the same approach for the south, which has different sea level rise projections because of the tide assessment done on the Woods Hole station and the Nantucket station relative to the Boston station. So this is one of the primary reasons why we divide the model up into a north section and a south section, because we have different sea level rise projections in the north and south. Now they're subtly different. They're not extremely different. You'll notice about a tenth of a foot in most cases, but there are two specific sea level rise projections that get built into MC-FRM. And that leads us to knowledge check 2 times. So I'll turn it back over to Julia.
Before we launch the knowledge check, there is one other clarifying question in the chat, Kirk, that's relative to your discussion of the tropical and extratropical storm modeling. Simone asks, do you calculate the length of time that the peak will last? So that was when you were talking about the tropical storm modeling.
Yeah, so the model and the weather data actually calculate the time the peak will last. So these are actually simulated storm events, both extratropical and tropical. This will become really apparent in the next session here when I show you how these work and what the results show. And so the actual time of inundation, the change in water levels is all physics-based, dynamically simulated in the model. So I'm not calculating anything. The model itself produces that based on the storm simulated directly.
Thank you, Kirk. So we are going to launch the knowledge check. We'll have 3 questions like last time to gauge your comprehension of the information, and we'll review anything that's necessary. So give me one moment to get that going. Okay, you should have a pop-up window in your view. Please go ahead and answer the 3 questions. We're starting to taper off. Let's take 30 more seconds. If you are finished and you do have a question, please put it in the chat box. We're at the 2-minute mark and it looks like most people have responded. So I'm going to display your individual results so you can see how you did. And then we'll look at the collective results. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the results. For question number 1, you all were listening very closely as Kirk went through the sea level rise projections. 2008 is the correct answer, and 83% of you got that right. So good work. The next question about the emissions scenario, the answer was true. We are looking at RCP 8.5, which is a high emission scenario, and 78% got that correct. Question number 3, you had the ability to select multiple physical processes that are included in MC-FRM, and the correct answer was all of the above. So for those of you that left out wind effects, 78, yeah, there's about 16 people that forgot that one. The model does in fact look at wind effects. So I think overall we did really well today. Nice work, everyone. So I don't think we need to review any content there, Kirk. We do have a question from Mike in the chat that you will answer in the next session. I will just say that his question asks if the model takes into account the built environment. So we're just going to hold that, Mike, until Kirk gets through his next slides. So if there are no other questions, we're going to move on to the next segment.
Okay. Back to sharing here. All right, so we're going to do a quick little exercise here for everyone, so you can stay awake instead of listening to me all the time. What we'd like to do is do a time horizon crosswalk with the sea level rise conditions, right? So we're focused on these curves out here under intermediate, which is the light green, high, which is the blue, and then extreme, which is the 99.9 percentile probability, the red here. And what the goal here is to come up with when this sea level rise, relative sea level rise, or mean sea level increase would occur. And so you have to use a chart to fill this out. So you're going to look at 2 feet, and then you'll come up with 3 different time horizons that would represent that 2-foot sea level rise, which says, hey, if I want to follow an extreme, it would be that would occur when. If I wanted to follow an intermediate, it would occur when. So I'll let you guys take a second to work on that. And I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes. And then I think if you're done early, great. I think we're going to take a 5-minute break after that as well. So from this point forward, you have 10 minutes before we're going to start again, where we'll go over the results of this exercise and then get into some of the details on the advantages and limitations in the model, which will answer Mike's question. So let's go, be back here at 2:35, or finish this crosswalk and then take your 5-minute break.
BLWE.
Right, I'm going to say we're off break and pushing forward. Here's the results of that crosswalk. You don't have to get the numbers exactly right. It just gives you some idea of, relatively speaking, the variability in the uncertainty in the sea level rise projections. So, for example, 4 feet of sea level rise spans anywhere from occurring 2060 to 2100, so a 40-year difference. Also relates to by 2100, somewhere on the order of a 6-foot difference in sea level rise. If you're in the nearer term, you have less variability, obviously, in those sea level rise projections. So hopefully everybody was able to get close to these values. If you're in the extreme, you can see that whether you're between 2 and 4, it's all happening before you get even out to 2060. Whereas you're at the intermediate, you don't even see that 2-foot sea level rise till after 2060. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about advantages of MC-FRM, why it's a little bit improved than some of the information that might be out there historically, and then also some limitations. Again, every model has limitations; they're not perfect. So here's some of the major advantages of MC-FRM relative to other tools and data output that may be available. It's very high resolution. So that unstructured grid allows for varying resolution. We get overland resolution of 3 to 7 meters, which is about that 10-foot or less at its highest resolution in certain areas. You can see again that Boston type urban setting of the elements there. So what we're really aiming at is getting reasonable information at a site specific or parcel level. For hydrodynamic physics based, it's a hydrodynamics physics based model. So we're not talking about a bathtub approach. We're really really trying to get that physical flow of the water, the waves, wind, surge, all correct. A lot of times what we see in some of the mapping products that are out there is, oh, the peak water level reached 10 feet. It doesn't matter what the pathway is for the water to get to 10 feet. Doesn't matter how long it stays at 10 feet, right? So if you have a very, very narrow flood pathway where water is trying to get through and it only lasts for, 15 minutes, you might not actually pass the correct volume of water through that opening to fill a large area. We see that in when we compare the FEMA results to our results. The vast majority of the differences have to do with that temporal aspect of our flooding, where we're looking at the physical flow of water versus just filling it up because the water level reached 10, and therefore everything under that must flood. It also includes nonlinear effects. So what we're seeing in our results a lot of times is variations in just superposition of water levels. So even for tides, if you say, well, sea level went up 2 feet and mean high water was 5, so it must be 7. That's not how it works when you have a deeper basin with changes in shoreline geometry. You might actually get a variation in what your water level would reach. So it's not just a linear addition. We see that over and over again for storm events as well. So the 1% AEP of today, if it was 10 and you have 3 feet of sea level rise, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden it's going to be 13. It's just not a linear addition. Another big advantage is high priority tidal structures. So we include all major coastal structures. That was included in Massachusetts. So things along the shoreline are included. Barriers to flow are included. Dams and their operations we went through are included. What's not included in Massachusetts is culverts and bridges. So we do not have culvert-based flow in the Massachusetts model. However, we are doing New Hampshire and Maine right now. That is being added into the New Hampshire and Maine models, is the tidal structural flow. Another big advantage is that if you believe in the changing intensity and frequency of tropical cyclones, that is included. So we are shifting that distribution of intensity and frequency of storms in the model. That was a decision made at the state level. And so as you go forward in time, those tropical cyclones start to become more frequent. The model was fully calibrated and validated to historic storms. Not every storm that occurred that we simulate do we calibrate to. We picked, 4 to 5 that were large and significant influencers, and frankly, that we had data available for at the time to calibrate to. We couldn't calibrate it if we didn't have data to it. We did do some validation against some of the recent storms after the model was complete. We went back and looked at some of those, specifically Grayson and Riley. This was peer reviewed by WHOI, USGS, NOAA, US Army Corps, Federal Highway, and EPA, except for that was the BHFRM process. So some of the elements that we included recently, run up and overtopping, which we'll get into in workshop 2, and we do have some uncertainty variables that we include in that for where that run up and overtopping occurs. The rest of the stuff was all peer reviewed. And then I think the biggest difference of what we're doing here is this probabilistic approach. So it's a Monte Carlo based simulation where we're just simulating thousands of events. We don't have to worry about joint probabilities of what the tide is doing. We just simulate so many storms that we're going to get the distribution right. It's kind of like if you're going to Las Vegas and you were going to play craps every day. And if you just played 1 time or 2 times, you would know what you would be more probable to occur, but you wouldn't know what your actual full probability was. But if you played for 365 days straight every hour, you would know what your distribution would be at the end of that. Unfortunately, you don't know every roll. What we're doing is we're basically saying we know what our distribution is because we're simulating everything. So there's just an example of the track lines for the tropical cyclones that have occurred over time. I mean, or in the synthetic case that we simulate. So this was a level 3 approach by Federal Highways. It's mentioned in the HEC 25 manual, which was released in 2020, and is earmarked as kind of the way that you should really do a comprehensive level 3 approach of coastal flood risk. Some of the limitations. So sea level rise in our model is not probabilistic. So everything is probabilistic except the sea level rise. So the sea level rise input that's going into does have probabilistic values. We talked about that 99.5. There's a 50%. There's a whole distribution of sea level rise. We picked one, right, for each scenario we ran. So it's an increase to the water surface elevation that's put into the model. It's not probabilistic from that perspective. Storms are probabilistic, the tides going up and down, probabilistic, all that stuff's probabilistic. Just the sea level rise is one static value. To do it fully probabilistically, we would have to vary that sea level rise as well under that same probabilistic time frame and window that the storms and everything else is. So that's one limitation. As I mentioned just a second ago, we don't have culverts and crossings in MC-FRM. We do have, obviously the crossings are there. If there's natural attenuation that occurs due to the narrowness of a landscape or an opening, that does occur. What's just not included is the low chord of each individual bridge. So if you're evaluating a low elevational bridge, you can use MC-FRM data to then do a specific model of the potential interaction with that low chord at a bridge. Same thing with culverts. If you have a culvert in there, we're not simulating that directly. So if there's attenuation that occurs through that culvert prior to it getting overtopped or flanked, that isn't in the model either. As you'll see when we go through the level 2 workshop 2 information, there is identification of where kind of those areas might occur. The third limitation, our digital elevation model is fixed in time. That means it does not change. So what you have today is what you have in 2050 and 2070. We are not changing the geomorphology. So if a shoreline erodes or a new inlet forms or a new adaptation gets constructed anthropogenically, that's not explicitly added in the model. So we have some places we already know about where between, say, 2017 and present, a new building was constructed or a new berm was put in or something changed. Those are not explicitly added to the model, as they happen. We're thinking that maybe the model should be run at about a 10-year cycle when sea level rise projections are updated, when the landscape can be updated. Frankly, between Boston Harbor flood risk model and this, it was about a 5-year cycle before it was updated, but just know that it's fixed. So things like dune erosion that occurs during a storm, not in the model. Model's very high resolution, but it's not micro resolution. So we've seen some cases where I've gotten a call and said, hey, this road is flooded. It says half of the road is flooded in your model. And it happens to be on an elevated embankment, and it's right next to the water. And the distance between the nodes covers kind of half the road. And so the interpolation of where the water level might be might cover half the road. And in reality, the road is higher than that and doesn't actually flood. So we have very, very high resolution, but just be aware it's not micro resolution, right? So if you're talking about areas of very steep elevational change, the model might have to interpolate in between some of those areas. Again, 10 feet, if you're talking about 5-foot changes and things like that, even 10 feet changes, you're probably on the edge of what's realistic for the resolution of the model. Here's a question I think that was asked in the chat. The buildings are not explicitly included. So we do have structures, coastal structures, things like that in the model, but we do not have buildings directly in. They are represented as frictional elements in certain areas, but they're not explicitly built out of the landscape. The water doesn't flow around the building. No model currently could really handle that from a stability and runtime perspective. So individual buildings are not in the model. We do, however, have submodels that look at that. I showed an example here. So if there's a need to really look at something, there's the ability to look at how flow and velocities change in an urban environment around buildings. It's just you have to get to even a higher resolution, and it's a little bit different thing. So buildings themselves, they don't pop out of the model and they're not explicitly included in the model. And the last real limitation is, and we talked about this earlier, there's no precipitation-based flooding. So if you have rain on the landscape and you form a puddle somewhere, or a bigger puddle, or it floods because it rains, that's not the point of the model. But this is a coastal-based model based on coastal-based flooding. So if it's flooded with salt water, we're probably going to get it right, unless it's going through a pipe somewhere. If it's rain, that's not what we have. However, we do also have an approach probabilistically that follows the very similar methodology to look at precipitation or pluvial and fluvial based flooding that we're trying to develop here to handle and produce data very, very similar to what the coastal data produces for the precipitation based flooding. So those are the major limitations of the model. Let's get into what this, yep.
Before we move on to the data outputs, there are 2 quick clarifying questions in the chat box that I think are worth taking. So someone is hung up on the sea level rise projections and the call out box about the ice sheet melt in the sea level rise projections and why our confidence in sea level not exceeding those values is lower. Could you quickly address that?
Okay, let me read the question
Yes.
a second.
So the question's coming from Nikitas.
Okay, let me find it. Let me go back to that slide.
Thank you. I just didn't want to move too far forward.
Yep. Okay, so these probabilities or these percentages here are the likelihood that it would be exceeded, right? So, for example, if you followed the high scenario under an RCP 4.5 value, we're 99.5% sure, not me, people that developed this, that that would not be exceeded. It's greater than that, so close to 100. They also assume that under 8.5, it would not exceed that value under the 99.5% likely not to exceed that value. When you include ice melt into that, that confidence level drops because it is more likely that that would be above the value that you select, right? So it's more likely that it could be exceeded, right? Because we have ice melt instabilities, right? And then under 8.5, with those emissions scenarios, there's even more variability in the ice melt. So your confidence level drops because it could be more likely that it exceeds the values shown here. Same thing here. So you're getting a dropping in your confidence of being quote unquote high enough, right? So anytime you start to add ice instabilities, it's more likely that the value could be higher than the one you selected. So when you're getting down into these scenarios with the intermediate level and you're down here and you start adding ice instabilities, there's a 50% chance that it'd be higher than that value, 50% chance it'd be lower. Does that help answer that question or explain it? I hope so. And if you really want to get into this, we can put you in touch with Rob DeCanto, who developed all these values. This wasn't us that did.
We've got a thumbs up on the response there, so thank you. And the one other question that we should address before moving on is coming from Joy. She has a question about the joint probabilities, if you want to advance to that slide.
Yep.
So Joy's question is, here's your bullet there.
I got it. I see it. Yeah,
Okay.
Joy. So yes, so it is because it does that automatically. So joint probabilities are things like, hey, I've got to look at what the relative phasing of is the tide relative to the storm passing, right? And there's a probability that the tide will be at a certain level versus the storm is at a certain level. When you do a limited set, like a JPMOS type approach to that, you then have to consider what the joint probability of those occurrences might be. Under a Monte Carlo approach, you don't have to worry about that because it all sorts itself out. You just do so many runs that some of the storms occur at high tide, some it's just like kind of trying to re-simulate reality. And what we did is we kind of gave it a little bit of a steroid injection too, because we then said, okay, maybe we don't even have enough. So we basically phased all the tropical cyclones because they're very fast moving with those phase shifts in tide. So we actually kind of gave it a little bit more of an oomph, if you will, with that joint probability. So yeah, it's basically because of the Monte Carlo approach that you don't have to worry about that joint probability, at least from the coastal stuff. What I'm not talking about here is joint probability of rain and coastal storms. We're not mixing the fact that you could have, a big rainfall event or some storm event that sits there and dumps tons of rain and increases the water level in the ocean a little bit so that the stormwater systems can't drain and you flood everything, kind of like Harvey and Houston. That's not what our model's doing. We don't have rain directly in.
Kirk, thank you for reinforcing those points. There's a lot of interest in the chat box for the next version of the model when that comes. But at this point, let's go ahead and talk about the products that we do have.
Right. So again, I would encourage, I personally think workshop 2 gets more exciting. The data is more, in my opinion, applicable for a lot of different things. But here's the level 1 data output, which really is 2 things. It's the annual exceedance probability mapping and raster-based GIS data and depth levels at three probabilities, which I'll explain in a second. But first, I think these graphics, hopefully you can see this moving. This is basically how this Monte Carlo approach works. We just simulate all these different events. This is one tropical cyclone in our mix. The colors indicate that water surface elevation. So you're talking about that storm tide, right? That's coming in. And then the wind effects are shown with the arrows. So we do actually have the wind dynamics, which are important when you get overland flow. The wind will push things in different directions. And then waves are all on top of this. And then here is kind of a zoom in to the Boston Harbor area. You can see the high resolution that exists here. Again, we learned a lot of interesting things right away. This is a kind of a 2070 big tropical cyclone condition. But you can see here the Mystic River actually flanks behind the Charles River Dam and floods the Charles River Basin. So I'm not blaming an engineer that didn't look at the adjacent river when designing the dam, but it's interesting how we were able to identify areas where there might be concern when we just look at the dynamic physics flow of water. So here's what these maps look like. Many of you have seen these before. I like this because this is the initial Boston Harbor flood risk model results, but I think it's really kind of clear and gives some good examples of how these data can work. So again, this is the annual exceedance probability, or what we're calling the coastal flood exceedance probability. The full distribution underlies the data, but just so people can visualize it, we divided it up into these bands between 0.1% and 100%. So again, if you're at a 1% level, that corresponds to the 100-year return period flood level, and that varies spatially. What that doesn't mean is that a 100-year storm will cause, if you can classify that, flooding to occur in all the green areas, right? The green areas might occur in one location due to one storm and another location due to another storm. So you might have flooding up here in East Boston due to one storm, but if you went further north or further south, that doesn't mean that same storm caused flooding. Or even here in South Boston, that might be caused by a different storm. Because we simulate so many, we get that full distribution of risk. What it does mean is you have a 1% chance in these light green areas of getting flooded. So during that annual year, there's a 1% chance that you're going to get wet. And what you can see is you get the spatial variability of those results. So you can start to look at where your risk may lie. And so, for example, up here in East Boston, and in the Winthrop area, you have that purple, which is at about a 20%, or once every 5 years you could expect to get wet. Where in this location in East Boston along the Greenway, it's about that 1%, or one in 100-year water surface elevation that you get wet. If you have various assets in your community, you can start to look and say, okay, this has a higher probability than this, so maybe I focus on that. It also matters who you are or what your asset is, right? Like, so for Mass DOT, the Highway Operations Center or a vent building for the Central Artery Tunnel System is much more important than a maintenance shed. And so, hey, they can live with flooding of 10% level at a maintenance shed, but boy, at the Highway Operations Center, I get nervous when I see the 200-year or the 0.5 level. If you're Partners Healthcare in the hospitals, you probably get nervous when you see the pink or the 1,000-year near your water level. And that's true because we work with them to look at this stuff. But you can see it gives you that spatial distribution of where risk may apply. And if you're looking at the Central Artery Tunnel System, it's not just are you wet or not, it's what's the probability of you being wet. But not only can you look at it spatially, but you can also start to look at that probabilistic risk at a temporal level, right? So here, if we jump to this 2030 projection, now you can see how that risk changed. So if we look at that same East Boston Greenway area, we went from that 1% level to the 5%, so once every 20 years. And you can say, oh, when might I need to take action? Not only where, but when do I become uncomfortable with that risk? And if we jump forward to a 2070 condition here, now that same Greenway area is now at that 50%, or every other year you could expect the probability to get wet. right? And so now you get both the spatial and temporal to be able to prioritize those adaptations, that risk assessment, looking at where and when do I need to take action. This is a much more cost-effective way to plan for adaptation than looking at a 2070, 100-year condition. That's it, because now everything is wet and you don't really know where to start. I thought it was worth just really quickly talking about cumulative probabilities. You know, 1%, sometimes people think, well, hey, a 1% level or 100-year, we don't have to worry about that, right? That's so rare that doesn't really matter. And that's true on an annual basis. However, if you look at a cumulative probability over a certain return period, you know, over a 10-year period, you have a 9% chance that you might get that condition. 25-year, 22. If you go out to all 100 years, you know, there's a 60% chance that you're going to see that condition. Doesn't mean it's 100% chance, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to get that 100-year return period event every 100 years, but the probabilities of actually getting these conditions aren't just 1% all the time. It builds up over a cumulative time. The data, the second data set that you get is not only the annual exceedance probabilities at this level 1 data, it's also these depth of inundation maps. I will say right now that I vastly prefer the level 2 data, which is the water surface elevation data. We'll get into that next time, but just know that these were generated as kind of a layperson friendly piece of information about how deep the water is in a certain area. And you can pull that out at any annual exceedance probability level you want. So this is the 1%. So I pull it out at the 1%. And again, if we just focus on this East Greenway area, it goes from a 1-foot depth in present day conditions to a 2 to 2.5 foot depth in 2030 to a 5 to 10 foot depth in 2070. And so you can start to look at how your depth changes over time in various areas. I'm going to turn it over to Brittany real quick. She's going to just give a little bit more detail on some of the data output on the level 1 basis, so that you can get a better feel, just not in that static Boston area, of some of the results.
Thanks, Kirk. So I just wanted to show everyone some of the data layers that Kirk just finished describing. And so he was speaking to graphics that were showing the BHFRM, but we do have raster and GIS compatible layers available for the entire coast of Massachusetts for the MC-FRM. And so I just wanted, so what I'm showing you now is Marshfield and Duxbury. We have the PowerPoint bridge over here in the harbor, and then most of this vulnerable area of Marshfield. So right now I'm showing you all the probability of inundation, or the annual exceedance probabilities for present day. And these are all in a TIFF file with a associated symbol layer file. And you can see how the vulnerability and extents of vulnerability increase through time. So that's 2030, 2050, and 2070. And then, as Kirk mentioned, we also have depth layers associated with each of the probability of inundation rasters. We can have the depth files for the 0.1% AEP. We can have the depth file for the 0.5 AEP, and you'll notice that the extents of those layers will match the extent within the original probability raster. In the present day, 1% AEP depth. And when you click on these layers, it will provide the info in the GIS framework. Might take a little longer since we're... So you can click anywhere geospatially and get the depth of flooding associated with that AEP level. So again, we have data outputs for the 0.1%, the 0.5, and the 1%. The one thing that Kirk did not mention is we also have exported polygon exports, which is our vector style shapefile. that also shows the extent of the 0.1 and 1%. So if, and say you wanted to do a fast behind the calculated number of buildings or miles of roads that kind of fall within that 1% or 0.1% extent, we also have shapefiles that show those extents. So the 0.1% should match that 0.1% extent of the prob rasters. And then the 1% should match that 1% AAP raster in the prob. And so we have those for two levels, the 1% and the 0.1. So those will be available on the downloaded platform that we'll talk about shortly. One thing I also wanted to bring to your attention before we move on that will come handy in a later exercise is CZM is sponsoring or hosting some of those layers. And we'll give you the link to this data viewer that is currently in draft form. And it's a really easy usable tool. It has the 2030, 2050, and 2070 prob rasters or the AEP curve rasters and the depths for the 1%. You can use the plus and minus here to zoom in as to the scale that you'd like. You can always push the home button to go to the default extent. The full distribution symbolization is located here on the right-hand side. And what will be most useful for you all during the next exercise is using this search bar. So you can search in a facility, you can search in an address, and that will help you navigate to a particular asset or location that you're interested in. So, and then you click the mouse to kind of drag around the viewer. So CZM, Margot and Julia will speak more to all of the other platforms that will be hosting this data. And at that point, I'll turn it back to Kirk.
Great, thanks, Brittany. Back to screen sharing here. I want to be conscious of time here. So I'm going to skip some of these examples and we'll come back to them, I think, in workshop 2. Basically how the level 1 data can be used. So there's a siting assessment here, including some residence time of flooding results. There's a simple pump station in Hingham that we look at just from the standpoint of the probabilities and depth information. There's a flood pathway assessment for the Callahan Tunnel. You can see here that you can utilize kind of the probability level results to identify the source of flooding as it comes into the area. And so, and then the final thing was this low-lying road work that's been underway with Cape Cod Commission using the probability results. But we're going to circle back to those next time. We're going to be doing tons of examples of how these data are applied and used to help probabilities and assessments. But let's go to the final knowledge check real quick. Do that, and then we'll be in the final little session that hopefully we can wrap up.
Great, thank you, Kirk. I do want to reinforce for those viewing later that the chat has had a little bit of activity over this last session, and there were a couple of clarifying points addressed in the chat box. One that is often asked is the clarification on the 100% coastal flood exceedance probability. That does not represent permanent tidal inundation in the scenario year. That is still coastal storm driven flooding. And then the other piece that you clarified in here that I think is really important is that when actual storm information is collected, Woods Hole Group has gone back in and validated the model results. And Kirk referenced 2 recent storms, Grayson and Riley. So for those viewing later at home, you're up to speed on our chat discussion. So now I'm going to launch the last knowledge check. Just give me one moment. You should now see a pop-up box in your window. We have 3 questions like before. Let's see how you do. Kirk, I'm enjoying seeing the results for question number 1 coming in. A lot of people are changing their answers.
These are some trickier questions, I think. So
We're nearing the 2-minute mark. We'll close the survey in a few moments. Okay, we've reached 2 minutes and answers are starting to stabilize. I'm going to end the poll and you'll all see the correct answers relative to how you responded. And then we'll look to see how we did as a group. Just give me one moment. Okay. So for question number 1, we wanted you to read through all of the options and select all of the different features that make MC-FRM unique. And we have 87% of respondents answering correctly. So nice job, everyone, listening to the content. Moving on to our second question. You also were paying attention when Kirk was talking about the DEM for the model and the analysis of flow. So MC-FRM results do not show water flow around buildings in our level 1 analysis and outputs. And then the final question, we wanted you to select which statements are true, and 95% of respondents answered correctly. At least one event in excess of a particular magnitude occurring in any given year defines the annual exceedance probability. So nicely done. We did not have multiple correct answers on that one. We tried to trick you, but you did well. So thank you. I don't think we need to review any content at this point. So turn it back over to you, Kirk.
Great. Yeah, good job, everybody, especially on C, or the third question. When you get into that probabilistic stuff, it gets a little hairy. So it was great. All right, last little session here. I'm going to have Margot talk briefly about where you can get some of these data, or at least view the data and eventually download the data as we get through these workshops and sessions. So Margot, go ahead.
Thanks, Kurt. Yes, just switching gears a bit now that we've covered the nuts and bolts about what the MC-FRM is to where you can access it. Brittany previewed one of the state viewers, and you'll get a chance to interact with it shortly. But first, I'm going to give a brief overview of a couple of the data viewers, showcasing these level 1 MC-FRM layers and preview where you'll be able to download these. So the first viewer on the screen is CZM's Massachusetts Ocean Resource Information System, or MORIS data viewer. Next slide. The second one is also a CZM product. It's the Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flooding Viewer that Brittany previewed. Next slide. And the third is the Resilient MA Map Viewer. We have multiple viewers to support different types of access needs, and I'll provide a little bit more information about each of these momentarily. In addition to viewing, as Kirk mentioned, there will be a model output download page forthcoming on Woods Hole Group's Woods Hole Group's website. Both level 1 and level 2 MC-FRM layers will be available here, and the page will be available at the completion of the training series. Some of you may have used MassDOT's GeoDot web portal to gain early access to the level 1 layers. The model has been updated since release of those in winter of 2021. We recommend going to the new data download page when it is released, or using the other state viewers I mentioned to ensure you're looking at the latest version. And now a little more context on each of these state viewers. So first up is the CZM MORIS data viewer. This provides level 1 MC-FRM layers as stitched statewide layers. They are organized by planning horizons, so the 2030, 2050, 2070 timeframes. And there are 6 in total, 3 for the coastal flood exceedance probabilities, 1 for each of those planning horizons, and 3 for the flood depths by planning horizon for the 1% probability scenario. These level 1 data reflect model version as of April 2021. Next slide. The MORIS data viewer also allows users to add layers to a map and has zoom functionality to support general layer exploration. Each of these layers has an ArcGIS Online layer description page with some basic information, and the viewer supports adding layers on your own ArcGIS desktop as an image file. Next slide. This next example is CZM's Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flooding Viewer. This viewer integrates the MC-FRM level 1 layers with other related coastal hazard maps listed in the blue header. These maps include the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA's bathtub modeling of coastal flooding above mean higher high water. It also includes a map of worst case scenario of hurricane storm surge and FEMA's coastal flood zones. Within the MC-FRM map tab, you will see 6 scenarios in that gray header bar. The image here reflects an example of the 2030 coastal flood exceedance probability scenario. So for each planning horizon, 2030, 2050, and 2070, we've grouped the coastal flood exceedance probabilities and the associated flood depth for the 1% scenario. So for each of the planning horizons, users can look at the projected extent of flooding and then using the legend to interpret the various probabilities from 0.1% to 100%, and then hop over to the corresponding flood depth for the 1% probability scenario. And Brittany previewed a little bit about this earlier, and we'll get into this more in the exercise. Consistent with Morris, these level 1 layers are from April 2021, and they're only available for viewing to certain scales. But as you zoom in, reflected in the image now, you can see the community facilities and infrastructure icons populate the map. And we'll get into this a bit more with exercise forthcoming. This last viewer I want to highlight today is the Resilient MA map viewer. Similar to CZM's Morris viewer, these level 1 MC-FRM layers are stitched statewide. They can be opened in ArcGIS desktop and linked to brief layer description pages and represent the model version from April 2021. So these are not rasters, these are shapefile kind of clipped polygons. And we're only showing the 1% and the 0.1% coastal flood exceedance probability scenarios for those same planning horizons of 2030, 2050, and 2070. Users can turn these on individually or simultaneously to see how the projected flood extents change over time for both probability scenarios. These clipped layers are used in the Climate Resilience Design Standard tool, which is also accessible on resilientma.mass.gov. And they are used to calculate project site exposure to sea level rise and storm surge. There are other MC-FRM level 2 layers in this tool, and we'll be covering those in detail during workshop 2 in May. I'm going to hand it over to Kirk now to kind of preview the forthcoming data access page.
Thanks, Margo. Yeah, so we're producing a download page that's going to be accessible via the Woods Hole Group webpage. It's always going to contain the most updated versions and metadata from MC-FRM. We're putting that together now. It's not going to be released until completion of the training series, but what it's going to basically be is allow you FTP access to the full level 1 and level 2 data sets. Here's an example just of the structure of the level 1 data sets. So you can go into the various years of results and then get your probability or your depth layers. And then level 1 data is divided into a north and a south and then individual towns. So here you can see the probabilities for 2030 for the various towns in the north part of the grid. Braintree, Danvers. You can select a download of each individual town or a number of towns from that site. So again, that'll be available at the end of the completion of the training series. So here's some of the links, as Margo mentioned, of the viewers and the future download page to get data specifically. You can request data from me now. Please be nice and don't all request it at the same time. And I do try to get people data as quickly as possible if they need data for projects or community efforts. So again, it's publicly available. We're doing our best to try to make that publicly available as quickly as we can. All right. I think we're going to do this one last exercise. We had 2 exercises planned. Again, I don't want to keep people too much later than necessary, but I think one exercise is probably worthwhile here. What we'd like you to do is identify these three assets in Massachusetts. I've given you the address here, and I want you to go into the CZM Coastal Viewer, which I think a link was posted for in the chat. If it wasn't, we'll post it again. Yes, it is. And see if you can fill out the annual exceedance probability that exists for these assets and how those evolve and change over time. So give you a good opportunity to play with the tool, see how it works, and just get a sense of at least the probability data that exists. If people do have to leave, completely understandable. Thank you so much for coming. If you are sticking around to do this exercise, great. And we will have a little bit of time for wrap up at the end as well. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes or so to tackle this exercise. Good luck.
We do encourage you to use the search function on the viewer in order to quickly jump to these addresses in order to save yourself some navigation time.
Brittany, I'm going to have you fire up the viewer too, and we'll walk through maybe Quincy High School.
Okay.
So Brittany, why don't you share your screen and we'll walk through one. People can continue doing that, but I thought it would be worthwhile to just do one together, or at least see that. So there's Quincy High School right there. Brittany has her pointer on it. This is the 2030 results. And you can see that although Quincy High School is a large parcel, what we would normally do is look at, the most frequent probability that might occur influence that parcel or that property. So in this case, it's the light purple, which would be a 10% annual exceedance probability. So under 2030, we would put a 10% probability of flooding in 2030. Then if we go to 2050, that risk evolves and changes, and you're now at 50% probability. So that means every other year, it would be likely that that would be flooded. And then if we jump to 2070, you would be at that 100% level. And again, just to clarify, that doesn't mean 100% of the time you're underwater, or even, you know, during sunny day conditions, you're getting wet. You're not. It just means that once a year, you would potentially be likely to be flooded. Now, I will show you a little trick. Remember, there's a full distribution of flooding results here, and we just have to bind or bracket them together to present a map that has reasonable colors, right? But if Brittany clicks on that dark blue area adjacent to the school, what will actually pop up is the actual exceedance probability, which in this case is 75.4%. So it's not really 100%, but it's in that band, right? We round up. So the actual exceedance probability is 75.4% under that 2070 condition. So it's not quite every year per se. So that's essentially how you start to look at the annual exceedance probabilities. And then you could, of course, compare that asset to other locations or roads or what have you to identify what's more likely at risk of flooding. Of course, the consequence of flooding of that might be important, again, relative to what that asset is. If it's a sewer pump station, that's probably pretty important. Electrical system may be very important. Maybe if it's some utility shed, maybe not important. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and just show you the kind of the results for all these, this exercise. So here's a table, and this would be the results if you went location by location. So Quincy High School was 10, 50, 100% involving risk. The Yarmouth Fire Department, less of a chance of flooding, no risk in 2030, 1% to 2% by 2070. And then the East Boston Library went from relatively low risk, but then took a pretty big jump, especially from 2050 to 2070. And so based on where you are geospatially, what happens in the area, what's happening with the physics of flow, you can get very different results in terms of probability. And I also, for those who wanted bonus credit, I also posted the actual probability levels, not just what you get from the colors off the map by clicking on that. So again, those are, we round up in most cases, so the actual probability is a little bit less than it was done. Now, we did have another exercise to look at flood pathways, but we're going to hold that till workshop 2. And we're going to, hopefully we can get to that later. And we're just going to wrap up for today. I appreciate everyone's attention. I know this is a long session. I know we have more to go. This is a very comprehensive model. And there's a lot of information that you can get out of this. And so it just takes time to get through it all. And I hope everybody's gaining an understanding of what the data are, how to use them, and so on and so forth. So Julie, I don't know if you wanted to.
Yes, I want to thank everyone that has stayed on for the duration here. And I also wanted to highlight the responses that we got from the survey. We had now 288 responses, and we looked at the comments that you all provided, and number one limitation that was articulated was access to layers. So we hope that you paid attention to Margot and Kirk's slides and discussion, and you now know how to access the level 1 information. And we will talk about future MC-FRM product access in the subsequent presentations. And then a couple other common responses that we saw, which we also will be addressing in sessions 2 and 3 of the training series, are the fact that these level 1 products are good for planning, and we will get into some examples on how we have developed municipal plans using this information. And another common response was that people really do want the model to be maintained and would look for inland flooding and precipitation being added to the model in the future. So we've taken note of that and all of your other comments. So thank you for providing us that input. Kirk, you are muted.
So thank you again, everyone, for sticking around and hanging in there with us through workshop 1. Workshop 2 is scheduled for May 4th. That's really going to get into more application examples, some of the more advanced data that you can use, comparisons to some of the other models if people are interested in that. The Resilient MA tool, because that uses primarily level 2 data. And then workshop 3 will follow that up on May 11th. I did have this really cool sneak preview video of something, but I think I'm going to hold off on that for the interest of time and make sure that you come back to see that. It's my kids will call it video game level quality of MC-FRM results. So it's a pretty interesting watch. So again, thank you for your time. Appreciate everybody listening.